Our speaker today, we're recording. So first of all, hello everybody. This is welcome to this year's inaugural meeting of the Stanford Psychedelic Science Group. I'm Boris Heifetz. I'm in the Department of Anesthesiology here and a neuroscientist. I want to also introduce Misha Carlson, who is in the PsyD program here at Stanford and has been our biggest cheerleader and organizer and getting all things together. If you have questions about joining the group, she's the one to reach. A little bit about the group. We've been meeting since 2019. That's when Gianni Glick, who's now on faculty here as a psychiatrist, he came as an intern with a little bit of help from me and Tricia Suppy is in the psychiatry department. He basically started these meetings. That interest group gave rise to a class that Gianni, Tricia, and I have been teaching for the past 5 years now, Psych 215, Intro to Psychedelic Medicine, which I encourage you to check out either for credit or just to hang out. It's offered in the winter quarter. And that also has grown into a broader effort. We now have Dr. Christian Greer, who I think is somewhere on the call, who's a religious studies scholar who's now in the Department of Psychiatry, and he's offering two additional courses this year that dig deep into cultural and historical perspectives on psychedelics. So things are blooming, blossoming, just at Stanford, but obviously around the world in terms of psychedelic science. Just before introducing Dr. Strassman, I'll just say that this is the first of four online-only meetings that we have planned for the fall quarter. I hope you all got the flyer. If you haven't, we'll maybe Misha, you could send a link to that and also join the mailing list, and then you will definitely get it probably a bunch of times. And for the spring, we're planning an in-person speaker series of folks a little closer to home. So I hope you'll join us for that. So on to today's guest. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Rick Strassman. He's a huge name in psychedelic science, one that I've known since I was in college in the 90s. And it was really the first information I ever actually ingested on DMT was from his writing. He's born in California. He was got his undergrad at Stanford actually, and then went to my alma mater, Einstein College of Medicine in the Bronx. Did a psychiatry residency at UC Davis, a clinical psychopharmacology fellowship at UC San Diego, and then in 1984 he joined the University of New Mexico's Department of Psychiatry. He eventually became a tenured professor and was on the clinical faculty. And really, that's where he did a lot of his really early groundbreaking work, essentially breaking a 20-year moratorium in the US on psychedelic research, full stop, by running DMT studies. Eventually, he did some foundational work on melatonin, the first to suggest that DMT was an endogenous neurotransmitter in the brain, a fascinating hypothesis, and then pivoted to administering DMT in clinical trials to 60 more than 60 volunteer subjects between 1990 and 1995, and charting all of the effects. Again, really foundational work. Over the years, he's continued publishing, speaking, theorizing about the intersection of neuroscience, spirituality, prophetic experience, most famously a couple books that he's written that you may be familiar with: DMT, the Spirit Molecule, and DMT and the Soul of Prophecy. And he has been, again, a leading light in this field for quite a long time. So we're really thrilled to have you join us as our first speaker. So, Dr. Strassman, I give you the floor.
Thanks, Boris. Great. Nice to be here. I guess we can go, well, before we start, let me get the share going. Okay, there we go. Yeah, before we start, getting into the meat of things, I thought I would, do some Stanford associations. Yeah, as Boris mentioned, I graduated from Stanford in '73 in biological sciences, and it was a heyday of new ideas going on with, consciousness. Jim Fadiman was there. We met for the first time. He, told me to study the pineal gland. Nancy Lethko was, teaching one of the earliest university courses on Indian Buddhism. I, took a course from the Hillgards on hypnosis, physiological psychology from Carl Pribram. I spent a year or two in Norm Wessel's lab. Published a couple of papers on developmental neurobiology of the chicken central nervous system. Don Kennedy, his electrophysiology course. This was before he went to FDA to head it. Seymour Levine, hormones and behavior, as one of the earliest classes on understanding the biology of hormones on behavior. Bill Dement, taught a course that I took on sleep and dreams. Bob Ornstein, the psychology of consciousness, and Eleanor Maccabee, child psychology. So it was a fertile couple of years of deep study of the brain and the mind and consciousness. And currently, Laura Roberts, the chairman of psychiatry, was a resident when I was at UNM on their faculty. So was Stephen Adelsheim in the child psychiatry department at Stanford, and Gianni Glick is the son of Dennis Glick, who I did my residency with at UC Davis. So I still have some Stanford connections and some good feelings about the place. So, I was thinking if you'd like, we could just, kind of do a, smorgasbord. People could raise their hand about which thing they would like me to, talk about: applications, new drugs, clinical issues, psychedelic sites, regulation, legalization, endogenous and exogenous DMT, and any number of other things. Or I could just, run through my slides. What do you think, Boris?
Rick, why don't we'll do it by acclaim. So put your votes in the chat and we will probably not count them, but just get a sense of what people are interested in and go from there. Okay, we have our first vote. We have our second vote. All right, I don't see how we can avoid endogenous DMT at this point. So I think that clearly has to be first. A bunch of votes for microdosing, ayahuasca,
Okay, let me
DMT.
get my DMT slide here. Oh, so I expanded it to both exogenous and endogenous DMT. Yeah, so with respect, to with respect, to naturally produced DMT, it was first discovered in mammalian tissues in 1964. So rodent blood, urine, and spinal fluid, and a few years later was discovered in human blood, urine, and spinal fluid. So the race was on to try and understand what it was doing. The focus back then was its possible role in endogenous psychosis, especially schizophrenia. So there were studies comparing blood levels or urine levels, spinal fluid levels, and psychotics versus normals. Um, but those studies were limited by the sensitivity of the assays and the specificity. Um, it was first, believed to be made in the lung. That's because of, some rabbit data, but, more recent, studies, demonstrated, that the co-localization of the two necessary enzymes occur only in neurons in the central nervous system. So, John Dean and his group at University of Michigan, GMO Borjigin's lab, um, published a few papers on naturally occurring, DMT. The first was, whether the pineal gland might make, DMT. That was a possibility, that I raised in the Spirit Molecule book, and it was based on a lot of, circumstantial evidence. They looked for it and they found it. This was a 2013 paper, I think. But they, continued, looking at, the synthesis of endogenous, DMT in the rodent. And in a 2019 paper, they found that, cortex made, DMT in the rodent, and the pineal gland was equivocal. And in a way, that's okay with me. I mean, I wasn't, really all that, wedded to the idea of a pineal source of DMT. Concentrations in the brain, in the rodent brain, are comparable, to those of serotonin and of dopamine. So that's, kind of, raises the possibility of a neurotransmitter system, using DMT. Um, so, what would the function, be? And it's hard to say. You usually look at drugs that modify neurotransmitters in order to start teasing up apart the role of that neurotransmitter. Like amphetamines affect dopamine. Amphetamines make you more alert and hyper. They help you focus. Too much can make you psychotic. Serotonin modifying compounds like the SSRIs influence mood, anxiety, sexual function. So you can, then extrapolate that, serotonin is involved in those mental functions. So, one of the most, striking elements of the DMT effect when you give it is the feeling that it's more real than real. So it is, tempting to speculate, although this obviously requires a lot more, study, that the, function of endogenous, DMT is, to monitor or to kind of, regulate our sense of reality. Um, but still, we really need to be able, to monitor, synthesis in vivo. John Dean is doing that right now. At UCSD. He's making incremental steps, but he is moving forward. And at some point, we'll be able, to look at, the synthesis of DMT in, in the living human brain, in all kinds of conditions. And that could be altered states. Might be psychiatric conditions, psychosis, depression. You might hypothesize that concentrations are lower in depression, higher in psychosis and mania. With respect, to exogenous DMT, there's still some work going on. Nothing as popular as psilocybin or even LSD. Um, there's interest in its role as a neuroprotective agent in stroke. Maybe helping regeneration of the brain, of neurons in Alzheimer's, TBI. There's a study going up in Canada with a pharma company called Algernon. They're working on I think they're beginning work with a phase 2 study, looking at if a slow, continuous, non-psychedelic, dose or infusion of DMT, may help either stroke recovery or reduce acute stroke size. Um, there's a couple of groups, looking at continuous infusions at, psychedelic doses. And there's a couple of, there's a couple of reasons of doing that, or, for doing that. One is you can study the phenomenology better. If you just smoke DMT or you give a single dose, it's over, by the time, or you start coming down, by the time you've got your bearings. So if you want to do any exploring of that state, especially interacting with these, so-called entities or, beings in that state, you need a, more prolonged exposure. Also, I think it has, psychotherapeutic applications as well. So if you want to, if you really, want, to dig deep, you can increase the infusion rate. If you want to then interact, with your therapist, you can lower the infusion rate. If you just want to kind of cruise at an intermediate dose, you can do that. So I think it has psychotherapeutic implications as well. And also, there's a handful of studies looking at DMT as an antidepressant. The first was at Yale a couple of years ago. Okay, so
I,
that's the latest with
I think
DMT.
I think we have a couple questions. I don't think we can let you off the hook without some more specific. So just in order, Aaron, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Hi, Rick. Yeah, thanks for the overview. So I had a question. So I've heard this hypothesis thrown around a lot that like a lot of endogenous DMT might be released from the pineal gland in near-death experiences. And I'm personally partial to this theory because I've had a near-death experience and done higher doses of DMT later in life. And I have to say, I think the kind of spirits or entities you encounter seem pretty similar to me, at least in internal phenomenology.
Well, yeah, I think that's a study that could be done. Currently the comparisons of the near-death state with exogenous compounds have focused on either DMT or on ketamine. The strength of the DMT hypothesis is it is an endogenous compound, and there is, as far as I know, no ketamine-like compound that the brain makes. That 2019 Michigan paper demonstrated that concentrations in cortex of DMT increase markedly in the dying animal, especially in the visual cortex. So in a way that is like a tidy package, that increased DMT helps neuroprotection, and might mediate at the very least the visual components of the NDE. I think giving people that um, experienced a spontaneous NDE and giving them DMT would be a inter-individual or intra-individual comparison, and I think it would be a fairly strong study.
Thank you.
Rob, do you wanna unmute?
Thank you. Yeah, Rick, I wanted to ask you about nomenclature and the use of the word psychedelic. And I'm not going toward entheogen, that discussion, really a different discussion, which is the notion of so-called classic psychedelics. And I'm not a physician and don't have much expertise on this, but I see people sometimes classifying drugs by their locus of action, and then they count something as a psychedelic based on its locus of action. But then that raises for me a question of, well, certainly ketamine, phenomenologically, people might consider that psychedelic, but I also think at some of the higher potency levels we're seeing for cannabis, I think people are having phenomenological experiences so I just wondering about how to draw the line between locus of action and phenomenology and sort of the relative importance of each of those considerations. So it looks like you've already anticipated my question with your slide. So
Yeah, nomenclature is a big deal. Yeah. Well, I come out on the side of just calling these compounds psychedelic, mind manifesting, mind disclosing. And the mechanism of action is important. But I think the description, um, you call, well, phenomenologically, the subjective experience on a psychedelic, and any number of compounds can produce psychedelic syndromes. They do slightly differ among THC, for example, salvia, ketamine, 5-methoxy DMT, because of the difference in their pharmacology. But if every element of your mind is affected, which is the hallmark of psychedelics, as opposed to, let's say, stimulants or sedative hypnotics, I think it's fair to call them psychedelic. The older term hallucinogen is really no longer in use. Neither is psychotomimetic. And entheogen, I think, is kind of freighted because it involves a lot of assumptions. Number one, theo, which is God. A lot of people don't believe in God. And if you do believe in God, certainly you're not going, to believe that a drug can generate contact with God. I mean, most, dyed in the wool, Judeo-Christians aren't, going to really buy that. And if you're an atheist, I mean, would you want to take an entheogen? Probably not. But still, you might get some benefit from taking a psychedelic. Um, and the empathogen and entactogen uh, label. It's more specifically referring to the methoxylated amphetamines and methamphetamines. With uh, with different subjective profile and a distinct pharmacology. And I think nomenclature wise also when you're talking about adverse effects, I think it's best to just call them adverse effects, to keep the discussion within a biomedical model, calling them challenging experiences, like a unremitting severe psychosis after taking too much LSD is not a challenging experience. It's an adverse effect, which is severe and chronic. So nomenclature, I think, is important, to clarify.
Actually, to follow up on that very last point, when people have acute destabilization after a psychedelic experience, for example, that really, I think, maybe straddles the line between therapeutic and adverse events, and is pretty contingent, at least from what we've seen, on how that experience is integrated, right? So the classification really, it's not clear for some time, like whether it was an adverse event or not. How do you think about that?
Um, well, I mean, if you've got some anxiety or destabilized or depressed or you're depressed, suicidal, I would call that an adverse effect. And then how you manage it would I think play out in the integration. Like, are you going to stay depressed without any therapy or help or support or an antidepressant, or are you going to let it just kind of fester? Um, so the context. Um, yeah, I think like an adverse effect is an adverse effect. It's an unwanted effect of exposure to a drug. And then how you deal with it, then determines its chronicity and what you might get out of it or not.
Uh, David, do you wanna unmute?
Hi, I'm sorry to lurch you suddenly into the weird, Rick, but I, I'd
I'm
love to
I'm used to
hear.
it.
I'm sure you are, yes. I'd love to hear where you stand these days on the ontology of the DMT experience, particularly the entities that seem to be encountered there, and why it is that a brain that seems to be built off, as a sort of prediction engine, um, manages to come up with worlds that are so unlike the sorts of world that the cortex is used to building.
Um, yeah, like I kind of speculate in a wild-eyed manner at the end of the DMT book about the location of the beings. Are they in some parallel reality, alternates, like an alternate, level of reality, parallel universes, dark matter, those kinds of things. And I got a bit off base, I guess, but still, it was fun to speculate about, because people feel these beings are more real than real, and you just can't ignore it. Um, so I looked around for various models to explain this consistency. And I've come to the, I guess, conclusion or the explanatory model that these things are previously invisible. so that, kind of, hedges your bets regarding, where, they're located. And I guess you can hedge your bets even more, by saying, they're experienced in the arena of the mind. That's where we perceive them. So, that's would allow you to speculate that the brain's receiving characteristics are changed by DMT, for example, and you're able to, peer into these, previously invisible, levels of reality, like, like a telescope, does, or a microscope does. Um, or it's, simply it's that, this, that in most people, giving a large dose of DMT activates the same, brain, centers, circuitry across the board, and that's just what occurs when the brain's exposed, to high levels of DMT. Um, where I've, kind of, taken things is it really doesn't matter at this point anyway, where the beings reside. I'm more interested now in, how do we get the most information from these beings? Like, are they are unconscious, in which case we can ask them things about our lives. Are they, like associations that are normally, not active? Like, for example, if you're a scientist, or you're an artist with, creative block, or, questions about things. So I think it's more important at this point, or I'm more interested at this point anyway, in in trying to optimize interacting with the beings, to the extent that one interacts with them. Like, how do you get the most information? So that's where I've kind of taken things at this point, rather than their epistemologic verity.
I want to follow up on that, Rick. There are two things that are kind of odd about the DMT entity experience. One is it's not clear how reproducible of an experience it is, and I know that you have firsthand experience with lots of controlled administration. So I'm wondering, how often does it actually happen? And it's very curious that among those people that are doing steady state infusions of DMT, where you're in that space for 30 minutes, there's not a lot that's actually been written in those papers about what is, the phenomenology that, is that a regular feature that people inhabit that space and are able to communicate? The third part of this is, all right, so people experience contact with entities. I can't think of another drug where hallucinations are so restricted to what are truly alien experiences and really seem devoid of human contact. That may not be true, and I'm wondering if you could speak to that about the quality, reproducibility, and the content of what people come back saying.
Hmm. Well, in our study, I would say at least half of our volunteers encountered discernible beings, and the rest, especially, well, yeah, especially in response to the high dose, the rest, even if they weren't able to discern specific discrete beings with whom they interacted, they still felt the presence of an intelligence and a power in that state with which they could interact. Human visions, or visions of humans, were quite rare. Um, and I think they were quite rare just because how weird the DMT state is. It just feels weird. And the visual imagery, was consistent with, this is a really weird place. So there's insects, and there's, sentient apartments, and there's, cactuses, and there's, spaceships and aliens, and, DNA and all kinds of things. There was, one subject, was, watching a human, work with, some machinery, but he only was able to, view him from the back. So usually it was not a humanoid or a human, that they saw. Um, so does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. So I get the sense that it is relatively reproducible, that's
Yeah, yeah. Well, with our tolerance study, we gave a big dose of DMT every half hour, 4 times in the space of a morning, and people just went back to that space each time, and you continued interacting with it. And a lot of people, there are a number of repeat volunteers. And yeah, it was quite consistent. It was, the DMT, world, that they, re-entered every time, they got a big dose.
amazing.
It's,
Um,
it is very interesting.
uh, Kate, I think you were next if you want to unmute and ask your question.
Hi, yes. I just read The Spirit Molecule and I was kind of, you may have already touched on this as well. I was just wondering what your most, I guess, unexplainable experience you've observed a patient undergo, like with either a being or like a situation they found themselves in, and how you might like using what you know about like the action of the drug, how you might conceptualize what's going on.
Well, I suppose, the two things which really, struck me as the study went on was number one, how the experience felt more real than real in most of the volunteers. And also the frequency and the consistency in the contact with beings. Um, I smoked DMT years before, and I had contact with beings. And I spoke to almost 20 people that had smoked DMT recreationally before I began my study, in order to start drafting a rating scale, and also to kind of figure out what to expect. And everybody said, get ready for the beings. But still, when I was giving DMT and hearing report after report after report, it was kind of startling. Um, yeah, so as Boris and I were just discussing, where are these beings residing, and why is that feeling so real? Um, there must be circuits in the brain that regulate how real things seem to be at any moment. There's derealization, which is a syndrome, depersonalization. People take things very personally sometimes, like a borderline, or like a paranoid. So there you must be something going on in the brain that regulates the feeling of reality. And DMT would be a good candidate for what might be regulating that.
I want to that's I love that answer, and I think it actually applies quite broadly to psychedelic medicine in general. That what if the feeling of insight is literally just the feeling of insight, and that there's a lot of I think controversy around how how therapeutic are some of the states that people enter, but maybe that's for another time. We had questions from Alex and then Saul. So Alex, you want to unmute?
Thanks so much, Rick, and I can't thank you enough for that book. As a psychiatry resident, that was one of the coolest things I read in a very long time,
Thanks.
and it was eye-opening in so many ways. And yeah, it's definitely up there as a tome in my library. Thank you for the amazing work that you do. I wanted to kind of just zoom out a little more globally and ask some very like a very basic type question, which is, what is the point of this DMT, and why has evolutionarily it survived in in humans? Like, what is the evolutionary advantage of this substance? And of course, there's ideas about neuroplasticity. At times, I would entertain maybe that, like, in periods of extreme stress, the human brain might ooze this DMT and reorganize itself, perhaps, right? Or it's always an interesting theory. I think Robin Carhart Harris described like the two serotonergic systems. The first one is like when, you just deal with the annoying boss. And the second system, which gets activated with these substances, is the I got to get the hell out of here and leave and find a new way to fish. So I'm curious to just explore that historic and more fundamental relationship of DMT and our evolution as a species.
Hmm.
Um, and its relationship to neuroplasticity and lastly, as a sleep physician, I'm curious, Is it possible that REM sleep is a psychedelic state of itself, and could DMT be involved there as well?
Okay, well, those are easy.
A quick question for you.
Well, what's the evolutionary advantage of DMT being so widespread in nature? Um, well, I just don't really know. Dennis McKenna's got some cool ideas, and he's able to trace back the phylogenetic tree of the existence of DMT. It goes way back, like way back. It's found in sponges, so it's been around for quite some time. Um, the question as to why there is endogenous DMT in the human and what advantage it may, or what or what function it may serve. You know, um, it makes me think of one of my pet things to think about is neurotheology, which Andrew Newberg coined. um, the evolutionary advantage of taking exogenous psychedelics, or the presence of endogenous ones. Is there an evolutionary advantage to its existence, or to consuming it? So you could, say it makes people more creative, more, pro-social, um, might even improve your vision. There are, evolutionary advantages, more peaceful, or, more, warrior-like. It's used, like ayahuasca is used, for hunting, maybe, for warfare as well, in the Amazon. So there are advantages, or boons anyway, within the culture, or the society. Um, that is a bottom up kind of model of, I guess, altered states of consciousness. In other words, the brain produces the impression of certain kinds of spiritual experiences, which are obviously extremely important throughout civilization. The opposite view would be a top-down model, which is one I put out in my Prophetic States book from 2014, which is which I call theoneurology, and it's a little more far-fetched, but it proposes that the brain is designed to interact with divinity, with a higher level of consciousness or spirituality. And DMT mediates the visual components of that communication. So it could be it could be a human oriented evolutionary advantage. If you look at if you look at the prophetic literature, it sometimes makes no sense from an evolutionary point of view. So that, I think, would help explain another way of looking at the spiritual properties of psychedelics, if indeed they uh, have been driving civilization for millennia. REM sleep. Yeah, Jace Calloway a few years, well, actually a long time ago, published a paper on pinealine, which is an MAO inhibitor that the pineal gland may make, and he speculated that during REM sleep, there's more pinealine secreted in the pineal, which would then allow whatever naturally occurring DMT is around to linger longer. This is one of the important reasons to start looking at in vivo synthesis of DMT in the human. Once we've got that worked out, we can start looking at, is it increased in REM sleep, NDEs, deep meditation, psychosis, depression, all kinds of syndromes.
Thank you
All
so
right.
much.
I'm amazed that you tracked all the questions and I think you got them all. Solomon, you want to unmute?
Yeah, hey, thanks. Rick, really honored to meet you. I enjoyed reading your book almost 20 years ago. And I want to just jump back a moment in the conversation to your conversation about the spirit beings and your interest in getting more information from them. I'm curious if you can talk a little more about that. How do you get the most information out of those beings, if any? And if you've identified any broad categories of information from respondents about what those beings can share, and sort of to bridge that to what you're some of the other things that we're talking about is how can it be useful to us and who can it be the most useful to?
Right. Well, in some ways that kind of hinges on a notion that Boris just brought up, which is if it feels like an insight, is it an insight? All because it feels real or feels true, does not mean it's true. You definitely need peer review, before you start acting on the so-called insights that you might gain from a psychedelic experience. Um, the Imperial College Group has been doing the continuous infusion for a number of years now. And there's a fellow whose name eludes me, who he wrote a book on his experience in that continuous infusion study. And he kind of made contact with some kind of wise being, and he interacted with it like over the course of these studies. Um, there's somebody else who actually came by here a few months ago. He to work on his documentary about the Imperial College work, and along the same line as the fellow who wrote that book. He believes that the beings will convey information to us to save the species. Um, but I'm a little skeptical because first of all, where's the peer review? Where's the data? How do you distinguish between what the beings are, telling you and what is just rattling around in your mind in the first place that then just becomes more convincingly real and true? So you may have a smattering that, oh yeah, we need more nuclear energy. You have a big DMT experience, the beings, say to you, it's nuclear energy. And then you go out and say the beings are saying it's nuclear energy. So I think you really need to be skeptical about the information that these beings are, sharing. What I would say is that the vast majority in the vast majority of cases, it's simply what's already in the person's mind that's been amplified and magnified and made more meaningful. It isn't really any new material. Like in our volunteers, they could describe the phenomenology of the experience in excruciating detail, the colors, the movements, the designs, the forms, the patterns, the interaction with the beings, the feelings and whatnot. But when you ask them what they gained out of the experience, other than it was a new benchmark for the psychedelic state, it was kind of banal. Like love is the answer. I need to go to Chaco Canyon. Love your fellow like yourself. There weren't any big insights. So that got me thinking. And this is a bit off topic about what do psychedelics do? And I think if you look at Aristotle and the Neoplatonic Aristotelianism, from the Middle Ages, they divide the mental apparatus into the imagination and the intellect. The intellect is abstract ideas, and the imagination is the arena for everything else: perceptions and feelings, body awareness, volition, reality sense, those kinds of things. Non-intellectual kinds of matters. So if you look at that model, which is quite old, but I think it's worth looking at again. I think psychedelics stimulate the imagination. Primarily, they don't stimulate the intellect that much. So if you want to get information from the imaginary contents that are brought to bear with psychedelics, you need to look at the intellect. So how do you enhance your intellect? Study and the practice of virtue and those kinds of things. if you read, sacred literature, there's beings there, and you have a lot of reports about how people interact with angels and demons and those kinds of things. I think, we can learn a lot from knowing, how those people, question the beings, challenge, their veracity. Are they good or are they bad? So I think the focus in some ways, I think to look at the utility of the interaction with these beings is to focus more on developing one's intellect to kind of keep pace with the stimulation of the imagination.
Thank you.
There's a lot of really great stuff in there. I hope that makes it into a book if it hasn't already.
Yeah, it's mostly Maimonides of all people that I kind of got that idea, kind of ran with it.
I mean, it makes a lot of sense that we should be interrogating other states, and I mean, plenty of people have come before. But anyway, this isn't my soapbox. Eric, you had a question you want to unmute?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks so much. Yeah, as a practicing clinician, I'm increasingly asked about, hey, should I do psychedelics? Should I microdose, particularly younger people? If I had courage and I wasn't scared of being sued, I would, encourage more people to do it. But most times I just refer them back to their MD. But are there certain presentations, disorders that I should just give a hard no? Like, don't experiment, don't talk to your doctor, just no. Like schizophrenia or psychotic spectrum or certain types of personality disorders. Yeah, just curious what I should tell people when they ask, or what the literature supports.
Yeah, well, if you look, through, my writing and my interviews, I never once encourage people to take psychedelics. I never do. I don't think I ever have.
Mm.
Uh, so, uh, and I'm not for legalization and decriminalization. I think there ought to be increased access,
Mhm.
but I don't think free for all is the answer. Um, I think there ought to be more research, so if somebody's interested in using, psychedelics for their depression or their anxiety or their substance use disorder, I would refer them to a research group that's doing that kind of work,
Mhm.
as opposed to saying, well, do it on your own, or do it with some underground therapist. Um, uh, yeah. And even schizophrenics, bipolars, back in the day that they were giving LSD, DMT, to schizophrenics,
Wow.
both for psychopharmacological sorts of reasons, like comparing the visions of DMT with the visions of psychosis, or
Mhm.
seeing if you can make schizophrenics more interactive if you gave them a big dose of LSD or DMT. So there are contexts within the research environment where one could justify giving psychedelics to people with psychosis. Ketamine is, or was given to schizophrenics in the 90s, and there was obviously lots of IRB discussion about doing that, but it was felt to be safe within the research environment. So there are preliminary data, um, for depression, psilocybin, substance abuse disorders, DMT for depression, LSD for anxiety, all kinds of things, psilocybin for existential distress, with a life-threatening diagnosis. But I just don't think they're quite ready for prime time. And once they are, the infrastructure really needs to be worked out. Who's going to give these drugs? Will there need to be special training? If you have a diagnosis, will that require a certain level of security and intervention? If it's just for creativity or spiritual purposes, does the do the guardrails not need to be quite so high? So yeah, I encourage more research. I suppose if a patient came to me and said, should I do psilocybin for my depression, I'd say, find a research group and see if you can be enrolled.
Fair enough. Thanks so much.
Kind of along similar, I think presage some of the answer here, but Irakli, you have a question if you want to unmute and ask. I don't know if they're still here. I'll ask it for them. So psychedelics gain broader acceptance in your experience. What do you see as the biggest hurdle to them becoming truly mainstream? Um, Regulatory barriers, legal barriers, limited access, expertise, cost, and stigma. I think we've already heard part of your uh, answer there, just that it sounds like you're not sold on efficacy yet. Or where I guess that let's start there.
Well, I mean, in controlled, clinical trials, they seem to be quite helpful. Yeah, depression, anxiety, that LSD, study that came out a few weeks ago. Yeah, ayahuasca, DMT, psilocybin, 5-methoxy DMT, ketamine, salvia may be a hard sell. I think 5-methoxy is going to be a hard sell as well. It's just as too destabilizing for broad spectrum application. What are the barriers? Well, these are Schedule 1 drugs, so that's a big barrier. Even though they're descheduled in a number of states, they're still Schedule 1, federally. So there needs to be some change there. Maybe a new schedule like, 1A or, something like that. When I was doing, my studies in the early 90s, I wrote to Janet Reno, who is the Attorney General under Bill Clinton, and I said these shouldn't be Schedule 1 drugs anymore, because number one, you can give them safely under medical supervision. I've established that, and number two, they have medical utility as research tools. So she said, well, it requires X, Y, Z. You can't really do it. So I think a new schedule makes sense. Schedule 1A, for example. It wouldn't be as restrictive, that you'd only use them within a research environment. I think a schedule 1A might allow their use for conditions in which there's some evidence of efficacy and of safety. So you wouldn't have to go through all of the regulatory and IRB hoops that would be involved with simple Schedule 1. I think also it's not really that clear, how much therapy or what kind of therapy needs to be combined with psychedelics. Do you need the subjective experience or not? Boris's study with ketamine under general anesthesia, seemed to indicate number one, there's no antidepressant response if you're under anesthesia, which I think in some ways indicates the importance of the subjective experience and what kind of subjective experience. Other groups are simply providing psychological support. But who are these people providing psychological support? Are they massage therapists or are they PhD psychologists? So I think there's still a lot of working out of the details before they're ready for broader application. The FDA rejecting the MAPS application for MDMA psychotherapy is illustrative of the kind of hurdles that the field is facing. Well, within the federal level anyway, at the state level, it's a bit of a Wild West environment. So I'm not sure how that's going to play out.
For reference, talking to Dan McQueen, who we brought up earlier in Colorado, he's administering psilocybin, DMT, and cannabis legally to people and without any particular fear of state laws in Colorado. There's obviously nothing is holding him back, which is remarkable. Gilly, I think you had a question possibly already answered in the chat. If you want to unmute.
Hi, Rick. Thanks for the very enjoyable discussion. I was curious if you have investigated like a kind of transcriptomic or gene expression approach to looking at tissue-specific production of DMT given that, as you mentioned, there's two enzymes involved in its production. There's a tryptophan decarboxylase, which catalyzes the reaction from tryptophan to tryptamine, and then an N-methylation enzyme as well. So I'm wondering if you think that there's any value in looking at like co-localization of the expression of those enzymes in determining which tissue it might be produced in, and whether that's valuable for finding places in the body where DMT is produced.
Yeah, well, I think it'll be key in determining whether or not there is a DMT neurotransmitter system. Nicholas Glinos has not yet published some data on knockout mice that don't produce INMT, the N-methylating enzyme. They still synthesize DMT. So it may be that the INMT is not necessary. It isn't necessary for the synthesis of DMT. There might be some alternative pathway in knockout mice. I'm not that up to date on molecular biology. Brian Roth is doing interesting work on the receptor, the 2A receptor in particular. And I've asked him a few times if he'd be interested in looking at the palatolates or whatever, some biological samples of some of the people I've heard from over the years who do not respond to a big dose of DMT. You can give them buckets of DMT and they don't respond. One of our volunteers was like that. I was at a party and people were smoking DMT, and this one gal was smoking a ton of DMT. Nothing happened to her, nothing whatsoever. So I think it'd be very interesting, to look at these, people's, 2A, receptor. Is there a SNP that makes them non-responsive? I would say I get an email like that once or twice a year. But, Brian was concerned about IRB issues and confidentiality and things. But, I still think it would be an important thing, to look into.
For them to us, we'll genotype them. I'm sure we can find a way.
I think they need to be genotyped. Exactly. Yeah.
I've wondered whether the psychedelic toad that produces 5-MeO-DMT has that kind of mutation that makes it non-susceptible. Something to look at. Thanks.
Misha, do you want to go?
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for all of your words that you've shared already. I'm a clinician and a psilocybin facilitator, so set and setting is really important to me. And I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on set and setting in DMT? Is it as susceptible as other psychedelics to environmental impacts? Is there an ideal set and setting for DMT administration? And how do you prepare research participants for your studies?
Well, our study occurred on a busy, clinical research unit at UNM Hospital. It was also an experimental chemotherapy, ward, for cancer patients. People were really sick on that ward, dying, throwing up, all kinds of stuff. So, and, volunteers were just hooked up, 2 IVs, blood pressure cuff, rectal thermistor that went up about 3 or 4 inches. And when I was describing the setting to these volunteers, they said, "Man, there's no way I'm doing that." But it turned out to be very reassuring to them. They knew that they were totally going to lose control, and we had it covered. So like I would speak, to the nursing, station, just before you're giving the DMT, and I would say, could you turn off, the PA system for, maybe 10 minutes if you could. So the ward got quiet, before we gave DMT. We put eye shades on the volunteers because after a few uncomfortable, sessions, it became, clear that the visions overlaid the room, and it was a research room with all kinds of gadgets, so you're like in this state and you're seeing these things and it's overlaid on the room. So that was a bit disorienting. So we didn't play music, but with a big dose of DMT, you're functionally deaf. You're out of your body and you don't hear anything, you don't feel anything. So like with respect to the preparation, my interest in doing that study in the first place was to answer the question, is DMT intrinsically spiritual? Will just giving a big dose of DMT produce enlightenment? I was coming from a Zen background back then, 20 years of Zen practice and study. And, most of our volunteers were practicing, some kind of meditation, but that was implicit. I was, curious, but it wasn't on my, NIDA grant, that's for sure. I just wanted to give DMT and see what happened. Would it be spiritual? Would it be psychological? Would it be good? Would it be bad? What was the phenomenology? And actually, the rating scale we developed was purely phenomenological. It did not have like an ulterior motive to improve any points. So what I told the volunteers is it starts working really quickly. You'll feel like you're out of body. You may fear that you've died, and you have a couple of ways of dealing with that. You can panic and say no, or you could say, okay, very interesting. What's next? So that was pretty much my instructions. Otherwise, I said we're going to hold down the fort. You just keep a clear head as best you can. You remember as much as you can, and then when you come back, we'll start talking about it. Most of the people were experienced, meditators, were doing yoga, those kinds of things. So, before the infusion, we, told people to just become as relaxed as they could. Obviously, their pulse was going up, their blood pressure was too, but they could manage their anxiety to a certain extent. So we gave people as much time as they needed, to calm themselves down. They'd close their eyes, they'd have the eye shades on, and at a certain point they'd say, "Okay, am I ready?" And we would give the infusion. We infused it over 30 seconds, and then we flushed the line with sterile saline for the next 15 seconds. And even within the 30-second infusion window, people started feeling it. And by the time the flush was completed, they were completely gone. Yeah, so people are in their own world. They're still, generally they're still, one person flopped around a bit, but generally they're still, because they're out of body and they just don't have any control. It's almost like like a REM state. They're kind of functionally paralyzed. Yeah, and if they got cold, they would ask for a blanket. If they needed a hand to hold, we would hold their hand. Yeah, so just basic life support, as it were. We fixed up the room a bit as the years progressed, but your eyes are closed, you're functionally deaf. It really didn't matter where you were. We started giving psilocybin, toward the end of my work, and that room wasn't going to work. So, I completed my, DMT work, by the time, or before we embarked on the full, psilocybin research. You're a sitter, and one of the points I was going to make, or questions I was going to raise, was the whole issue of do you need to be experienced to be a good sitter? And that would be a very simple study to do. Look at the outcome of people who are being treated by experienced, sitters compared, to those, without their own psychedelic experience. It's, kind of, believed that if you're experienced with these, substances, you would be a better therapist. But I think it might, run the other way. In other words, you might have, preconceptions about the kind of trip that you need to get better. And that wouldn't be the case in an inexperienced, sitter who was just a good therapist.
Rick, do you have time for a couple? We're past the hour, but there's you still have there's a lot of interest. Clearly, do you have time for a couple more questions?
Sure.
Great. I think we have Maddie and then Austin. Maddie, are you on?
I am here. I won't turn my camera on because I'm on my phone, but I will ask. Hi, Rick. Very exciting to hear you talk about your work. This question kind of follows up on Misha's question about kind of the susceptibility of the DMT experience to set and setting. In your book, you talked about a handful of patients who felt as though the beings that they're interacting with were also studying them in return. So I'm wondering what you, or how you, whether or not you think the clinical research setting played a role in this experience, and then more broadly, how the clinical research setting, like you might have touched on this already by answering Misha's question, but with DMT specifically, how the research setting might play a role into the type of experience that people have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's a question that I think is important. But let's see, how do I want to answer that? I think that I think the volunteers may have had the experience of being studied by the beings for reasons other than the research environment. Like, for example, I wasn't at all interested or knew anything about alien abduction literature, but because of the experiences the volunteers were having, I started looking into it, met John Mack, his book, Abduction, was quite interesting. And if you read, those accounts, like, there's a lot of, phenomenological overlap between the abduction experience and a big DMT experience. There's inner vibration, there's a breaking in breaking into freestanding world where there's where there are these beings interacting with you, and a lot of those folks in John Mack's work were being studied, were being investigated, things were being done to their body. So I don't think it's completely the result of our volunteers being in a research unit that they felt they were being studied or interacted with by the beings in that way. Set and setting, I think there's the intention as well. And if David Spiegel's listening in, I hope he perks up with what I'm about to say. I think psychedelics they are enhancers of suggestibility. They make you more suggestible. They also make you more hypnotizable. That there were a couple of studies back in the day where they demonstrated LSD made you more amenable to to being hypnotized, and Robin Carhart Harris replicated that a number of years ago. So one of the things, or one of the ways I believe that psychedelics work is as super placebos. If you look at the literature, they do everything. If you look at field reports, they make you more eco-conscious. Your marriage is better. You're more progressive. You're more full of awe. You believe that non-animate objects have consciousness. They do everything that you want them to do. So I think with the placebo response, it would be very cool to look at placebo responsiveness, hypnotizability, suggestibility, in terms of the outcome of any psychedelic interventions. Would people who are more hypnotizable, more placebo responsive, do better in a depression study, for example? And I think it also helps militate against a feeling of psychedelics being solely good. There's neo-Nazis summer camp things where they're taking LSD. People were taking LSD in the Manson family. That suicide cult in Japan who poisoned the subways, used a lot of LSD in their ceremonies. So I think that they'll do what you intend them to do, either yourself or your setting, where things are set up in a certain way to eventually to eventuate specific desired outcomes. Even the questionnaires, which a lot of people use, are primed to give people certain experiences which they would not have if that questionnaire was not used. There was a DM study in Germany some years back using the psychotomimetic model. They were interested in how similar is the DMT state to schizophrenia. So they recruited normal volunteers, they gave them DMT, they said this is a schizophrenia study, and here's your schizophrenia questionnaire. Scores were very high on schizophrenia rating scales. So you you steer the effect with both suggesting things within the context or the atmosphere or circumstances of the study, and you can validate them in a lot of ways by the questionnaires that you choose. That's a bit of a sidebar, but I think it's an important one to bring up.
One of my favorite quotes is it's not really a quote, but people administering the mystical experience questionnaire and having participants say, God, I wish I experienced some of the things that you're talking about. That's I think the suggestion is strong. Austin.
Hi, Dr. Strassman. Thank you very much for your time tonight and sharing all your thoughts. It's been really enlightening. So my question is a little bit harkens to a couple of things that were brought up about just sort of how open I guess society is becoming with psychedelics. And back in like 2012, I had reached out to you through email. I was a junior in high school at the time and had read your book, was very fascinated, and wanted to pursue a career in psychedelic research. I was coming from a small rural town in North Carolina and was just generally asking your career advice. You had told me, among other things, that um, it it would behoove me to keep my interest in psychedelic research sort of close to my chest, and I did that throughout I guess college and most of grad school. I had a mentor that sort of asked, or that was encouraging me to sort of like bring it out, and it took him some time, but he eventually did. Um, I guess this is like 13 years later. I'm now a postdoc in Boris's lab. And so despite me accepting in high school that I wouldn't be able to do scientific research on psychedelics until I'd already established myself as a rigorous scientist, and then when I was 60, I could do something with LSD.
Right.
I'm 30 now, so it seems like things are changing. At least my like post-hoc retrospective analysis from my personal experience is that maybe in 2012 it was a little bit more like iffy if you wanted to come out about that. But I guess like my question to you, long story long, is uh, what advice would you give younger me today in terms of somebody that's interested in studying psychedelics? Like I know I see a lot of my colleagues and peers will sort of are very open about it, and I think my perception at least is that probably skews their experimental attempts, and that they believe that it already works, and so they're very open about that. But I guess that's a little bit of an aside. Would you give the same advice today to a young scientist, or would you modify it?
Um, yeah, I think they're still controversial. Tucker Carlson, who's got the second biggest podcast in the US, thinks that, they open you up, to demonic forces. He's got a big demographic. So I think that points to the importance of not overreaching. The psychedelic state is not entheogenic. You don't want to get, God involved in these discussions. So I think if you're coming from a conservative environment, especially important to keep your cards close to your chest. The advice I give every kid or young adult or late teen about studying psychedelics is just get the best education you can, and then you'll find out what you want to do. You would or the the ideas I would try to get across is take courses in anything you believe would help us understand the psychedelic state better, and in anything that you believe the psychedelic state would enhance our understanding of. So you wouldn't need to telegraph or advertise your interest in psychedelics until you knew what you wanted to do. Like for example, I was talking with Boris early on about why I ended up at Albert Einstein Medical School. And it was because it was the only interview that they didn't ask me why I wanted to be a doctor. Every other interview, I said, I want to give psychedelics. And they all said, forget it. This was 1972. So I went to medical school in 73, and I got depressed because nobody wanted to talk about psychedelics. So I dropped out, ended up at a Zen monastery, and I just learned to study, like, carry wood or, chop wood, carry water. It was like study and get A's. So, that's all I did. I just, kept my interest to myself. And until I was in a position to start, studying psychedelics. Like my first, job at a residency, was up in was up in, Fairbanks, Alaska. And I thought, well, I'll just, be up here. My girlfriend wanted to, study wildlife, biology back then at the time. And I, kind of had redesigned myself like there's never going to be a, time to study psychedelics. But this was, 1981. There was just the publication of an assay in humans of melatonin. And then there was winter depression. And I was in Fairbanks. I was like, well, everybody's got winter depression here. It's the pineal gland. And I was obsessed with the pineal gland back then. And I thought, well, this may, be my, segue into studying psychedelics. So after a year in, Fairbanks, I took a fellowship in psychopharmacology research, got my chops to at least, design studies, went to UNM, studied melatonin, didn't say anything about psychedelics. But I was interested, like there wasn't much, known back then about the human psychopharmacology of melatonin. There was some preliminary data that it might be psychedelic, might make depressive, psychotic, might be involved in dreams. So, we just gave melatonin and looked at its endocrine and subjective effects. And I got a grant and published some papers and took course uh, in statistics. And then after we found that melatonin was only sedating, I was well positioned to be able to say, okay, I really want to study psychedelics instead. And I just, changed my course. By then, though, I had the credentials. I had the training, the background. I could prove that I, could do, clinical research. I'm in publish and write grants and whatnot. So I think it behooves one to just, lie in wait until the right time, before you start, pursuing a career in this. Yeah, that's a conservative approach, and that's an academic approach. There's a lot of people who do all kinds of things with psychedelics. But if you want to make an impression or influence the discussion academically, I suggest the approach I took.
That's wise advice. Well articulated. Thank you.
I just want to add that, Rick, while you're talking, I dug up a response to me from you from April 1999 with much the same advice. I know of at least two other people on this call who you have advised in one way or another over several decades now, and really formed, you shaped the present and I think the future of psychedelics. So I want to thank you for that. I think this is probably a good place to wrap up. Although, I'll certainly stay on for a couple, Rick, if you're game. But
Sure.
thank you so much again, Rick, for joining us for a wide-ranging and very interesting and informative and I think sage discussion on what the future of psychedelics holds and how to interpret some of the things we've been hearing about. So again, thank you again, and thanks everyone for joining. We've got another speaker in a couple weeks.
Well, thanks, Boris. It was great.
Thanks, everyone.